The crystal stem snapped in her fingers, and red wine arced across the white tablecloth, straight onto the man in the charcoal suit. It hit his chest like a flare. Conversations died mid-syllable. 100 expensive eyes locked onto the waitress. Then the room did the one thing it never did around him. It went completely silent. His head lifted slowly. Not angry, worse. Curious, as if he'd just seen a move on a chessboard he didn't recognize. Nina didn't apologize. Not right away. Her hand stayed frozen in the air, the empty glass trembling, and she forced herself to breathe through her nose like she'd practiced. The club's chandelier light made the wine look almost black on his lapel. The man's jaw worked once, the muscle popping under his cheekbone. 2 bodyguards along the wall shifted their weight at the same time. Nina's eyes flicked down for half a second, only half. Under the table, near the boss's left knee, the thin seam of the service panel sat just barely out of alignment. A mistake you wouldn't see unless you had spent months polishing these floors and crawling under these tables after closing to retrieve earrings, cufflinks, and lost pride. Tonight, she had noticed it the moment she set down the first course. Tonight, she had decided she couldn't unsee it. The boss leaned back slightly in his chair. The wine soaked into his shirt, spreading under the vest like a bruise. He didn't wipe it off. He didn't look at the stain. He looked at her face, reading it like a document. "What's your name?" he asked. His voice didn't need to be loud. It carried anyway. Nina swallowed. "Nina?" A small pause, like he was weighing whether her name mattered. The maitre d' appeared as if conjured, pale and sweating in his tuxedo. "Sir, I am so—" The boss raised one finger. The maitre d' shut his mouth instantly. Nina could feel the whole room waiting for the ritual, the public punishment, the reminder that money bought gravity and everyone else just orbited. The boss's gaze drifted to her hands. "You're shaking," he said. Nina forced her fingers to still around the broken stem. "I'm sorry." There, polite, correct. But her eyes went once more to the underside of the table, to the panel, to the tiny shadow where something metallic didn't belong. The boss followed her gaze. His eyes narrowed, almost imperceptibly. Then he smiled, just a thin rearrangement of his mouth. Not warmth, not humor, more like acknowledgement. "You spilled wine," he said. "That's a simple mistake." Nina didn't answer. He leaned forward slightly, and the movement made his cuff flash. A heavy watch, understated but obscene in its quiet cost. His hands were clean, nails trimmed. The hands of someone who never carried anything heavy. Other people carried for him. "What else is simple?" he asked. The question was soft, but the room tightened around it. Nina's throat felt too small. She could taste copper from biting her tongue earlier. Behind the boss, at a table reserved for the friends of the house, a woman in a pearl dress stared at Nina with open disgust, as if Nina's existence had personally offended her. Near the bar, a young man in a blue suit had his phone angled low, the camera probably rolling. People always wanted a moment like this. Luxury served with humiliation. Nina didn't look away. She couldn't afford to. She had learned a long time ago that when adults wanted you to flinch, they didn't always raise their voices. Sometimes they just waited. She set the broken stem down carefully on the edge of the tablecloth. Her other hand, hidden by the angle of her body, pressed her phone against her apron at hip level. The screen was dark. Recording. No lights. She hadn't planned to record tonight. But when she'd noticed the misaligned panel, her foster mother's voice, strict, tired, protective, had risen in her mind. If something feels wrong, you don't ignore it. You document it. You get proof. Proof is what people like us get instead of protection. The boss's eyes returned to Nina's face. "Nina," he repeated, as if tasting the syllables. "You work here long?" "6 months," she said. He nodded slowly, watching her like she was a minor inconvenience that might turn into a major problem. At the far end of the room, the club's manager, Marin, stood near the curtain that hid the private entrance. Marin's expression didn't change, but her eyes were on Nina with the focus of someone tracking an accident before it became a catastrophe. Marin had hired Nina without asking too many questions. She'd offered a uniform that fit, a schedule that didn't punish her for being in school, and a rule Nina understood immediately. You see everything and you say nothing. Nina had followed that rule. Until tonight. The boss reached for his napkin and dabbed the wine once, as if to show the room he could be civilized. Then he placed the napkin down and did not touch it again. "You know who I am?" he asked. Nina hesitated. The correct answer was yes. The safe answer was no. The true answer was that everyone in the city knew without anyone ever saying it out loud. "I know you're a guest," she said carefully. A few people laughed nervously, like that line had been brave or suicidal. The boss didn't laugh. His eyes stayed on her, calm and sharp. "A guest," he repeated. "In my favorite room." He glanced to his right. A man seated beside him, older, with a judge's posture and an expensive calm that didn't quite hide his tension, cleared his throat and looked down at his plate like he wished he could disappear into it. Nina recognized him, too. Not from TV, from the way Marin had suddenly become extra polite when he walked in. From the way the staff had been told not to speak to him unless spoken to first. From the way security watched him like he was both protected and dangerous. The boss's gaze flicked toward that man for the briefest moment, then back to Nina. "Tell me," the boss said, "why did you really do it?" Nina's pulse hammered in her ears. She could feel the microphone of the world pressed against her throat. One wrong sentence and she'd be escorted out a back door and told she was lucky. Her eyes dropped again to the table edge. If there was something under there, if someone had planted something, then the boss being seated there wasn't an accident. And if the boss was the target, then everyone in this room was collateral. Nina forced her voice to stay steady. "It was my mistake." The boss leaned in closer, close enough that she could smell the clean spice of his cologne and something colder underneath. Control. His voice lowered so only Nina and the man beside him could hear. "Try again," he said. The judge's hand tightened around his fork. Nina felt her lungs squeeze. Because the boss wasn't asking if she had spilled wine. He was asking what she had seen. And the worst part was the way he asked it, like he already knew the answer. Nina's phone vibrated once against her hip. A silent notification. A security system ping she didn't understand, except for the single word that flashed briefly on the screen before it dimmed again. Lock. Nina's stomach dropped. The doors had just been sealed. Nina didn't move, but her mind did, fast, precise, like it had been trained by years of reading rooms before they turned on her. The word lock had appeared for less than a second, yet it changed everything. The club didn't lock down for spilled wine. It locked down when someone important was about to be protected, or when someone dangerous was about to be contained. The boss's eyes stayed on hers, unblinking. He saw the flicker of panic she tried to bury. "You got a message," he murmured. "It was nothing," Nina said. The judge beside him, Judge Harlan, shifted in his seat. Nina had heard his name once in the staff corridor, spoken by Marin in a tone that meant, "Don't ask." He looked like a man who had spent his life being listened to. Tonight, he looked like a man realizing he might not be heard at all. The boss's right hand rested near the edge of the table, fingers relaxed. No rings, no flash. Authority didn't need decoration. "Nothing," he repeated, and his gaze slid downward, to the space under the table. Nina's throat tightened. Then the boss did something small that made the air go cold. He tapped his knuckle twice on the wood. A bodyguard along the wall moved instantly. Not toward Nina, toward the table's far side, with a decorative curtain met the floor. The man didn't crouch. He didn't rush. He just drifted closer, like he'd been told to look casual while ending someone's entire night. Nina could feel eyes on her from every direction. The guests weren't talking anymore. They were watching the way people watched an animal in a trap, curious, safe behind glass. Maren stepped out from the private entrance curtain. Her heels didn't click. Nina noticed that. Maren only walked quietly when she didn't want a room to know she was moving. Maren's gaze hit Nina first, then the boss's stained lapel, then the judge's pale face, and finally the bodyguard near the curtain. In 2 seconds, she assembled the situation and decided on a lie. She approached the table with a practiced smile that could soothe billionaires and terrify staff. "Sir," Maren said, voice warm, "we're handling a small systems update. Nothing to worry about. Nina will be replaced immediately." The boss raised his hand again. Maren stopped mid-sentence. He didn't look at her. He looked at Nina. "That panel," he said softly, "under my table." Nina's heart slammed against her ribs. She could feel Maren's attention sharpen beside her, like a blade being drawn. "I don't know what you mean," Nina said. The boss's expression didn't change. "You've been here 6 months," he said, "long enough to know where the service panels are." He leaned forward just a fraction. The stained vest pulled tight across his torso. He didn't care. The stain had stopped being the point. "You didn't spill that wine by accident," he said. "And you didn't look under the table because you were embarrassed." Nina forced herself to breathe. The safest move was to play stupid. The smartest move was to buy time. So she gave him the only truth that wouldn't expose everything. "I saw something that didn't belong," she said quietly. The room didn't hear her words, but it felt them. A ripple of discomfort moved through the guests. People leaned in without meaning to. Judge Harlan's hand tightened on his napkin. The boss turned his head slightly toward the judge, like he was letting him share the moment. "You hear that?" the boss asked calmly. "Something that didn't belong." The judge's lips parted. No sound came out. Maren's smile had vanished. She was still, watching the boss like she was trying to predict what version of him she was about to meet. Nina's phone buzzed again, one short pulse. She didn't look. She already knew it wasn't a friend texting. The boss noticed the micro-flinch in her fingers. "You keep it close," he said, nodding at her apron. "That phone." Nina's pulse pounded. In foster homes, phones were taken away as punishment. Privacy was a privilege. Nina had learned to protect her small privileges like they were oxygen. "It's for work," she lied. The boss's gaze sharpened. "No." He said it like a verdict. Then he looked past her shoulder. "Bring me the house manager," he told one of his men. Maren's eyes widened a fraction. "I'm right here," she said smoothly. The boss finally looked at her. It was like watching a room's temperature drop. "Maren," he said, as if he'd known her name all along. "Tell me why the door's just locked." Maren didn't blink. "They didn't lock, sir. We have a temporary sensor glitch in the west corridor." The boss nodded once, slow, polite. Then he turned his head slightly and spoke to the judge, conversationally. "Do you enjoy her voice?" he asked. "It's very confident." Judge Harlan swallowed. What?" The boss kept his eyes on Maren. "She speaks like she's protecting someone," he continued, "or hiding something." Maren's throat moved as she swallowed, but her posture stayed composed. "Sir," Maren said, "it's a private club. We keep guests safe. That's all." "Safe," the boss repeated, and the word sounded like it meant something different to him. His gaze shifted back to Nina. "What did you see under the table?" he asked. Nina felt every eye in the room on her now, even if most of them pretended to stare at their drinks. If she said the wrong thing, she would create panic. If she said nothing, Whatever was under the table stayed under the table. So she chose the third option. She made the truth smaller. "A seam," she said, "like someone opened the panel and didn't close it right." The boss held her gaze. "And?" Nina hesitated. Marin's eyes flicked to Nina's apron, subtle, urgent, a warning. Don't escalate. Don't say more than you have to. But Nina couldn't ignore what her gut was screaming. "Metal," she said softly. "Just a corner, like a piece of hardware." The boss didn't react outwardly, but the judge did. Judge Harlan's face drained. He knew. Nina saw it instantly. He wasn't surprised. He was terrified of confirmation. The boss's gaze slid to the judge again. "You look unwell," he said. "Is that because of the wine or because of the hardware?" Judge Harlan's voice came out hoarse. "I don't know what she's talking about." The boss smiled faintly, without humor. "You do," he said. Then he leaned back and spoke louder, just enough for the nearest tables to hear. "Everyone stay seated," he said calmly. "We're handling a maintenance issue." The way he said it made it an order and a reassurance at the same time. Some guests actually relaxed, as if obedience itself was safety. Nina didn't, because she noticed something else. Along the far wall, two men in matching dark suits weren't part of the club staff. Their earpieces were different. Their shoes were scuffed in a way people's shoes got scuffed when they spent time in stairwells, not dining rooms. They were looking at each other, not at the boss, and they looked impatient. Marin saw them too. Nina watched her eyes flicker, then sharpen. Marin leaned toward Nina, lips barely moving. "Don't do anything heroic," she whispered. Nina whispered back without moving her mouth. "The doors are locked." Marin's smile returned for the room, but her eyes stayed hard. "Exactly," she whispered. "So be smart." The boss signaled with 2 fingers. His bodyguard finally crouched near the curtain and slid a hand under the table edge, careful, almost gentle. He didn't yank the panel open. He tested it first, like he was checking for pressure. Nina's stomach knotted. The bodyguard's eyes lifted to the boss, a subtle nod. Something was there. Judge Harlan made a small sound, half breath, half prayer. The boss didn't move. He looked at Nina again, and his voice lowered, private. "You didn't spill the wine to embarrass me," he said. "You did it to make me look down." Nina didn't answer. His eyes narrowed. "Why?" he asked. Nina could have lied. She could have said she panicked. She could have blamed nerves. But the truth was sharper than any excuse. "Because I thought you were the target," she said quietly. The boss stared at her for a long beat. Then, very softly, he said something that made Nina's skin go cold. "Maybe I am." For a fraction of a second, something shifted in the boss's eyes. Not fear, recognition. The bodyguard's hand was still under the table panel, frozen in position, waiting for instruction. The entire restaurant held its breath like a single organism. "Everyone," the boss said calmly, without raising his voice, "finish your drinks." It was such an ordinary sentence that half the guests obeyed automatically. Glasses lifted. Wine trembled in crystal stems. The illusion of normalcy snapped back into place, thin, fragile, deliberate. The boss leaned slightly toward Nina again. "You thought I was the target," he repeated. "That suggests you think someone here wants me gone." Nina didn't answer directly. She glanced just once at Judge Harlan. The boss followed her gaze. And that was when the judge's composure cracked. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. A tightening of his jaw. A flicker of calculation in his eyes. The kind of look people got when their plans started slipping out of their control. The boss noticed. Of course he did. He turned his head fully now, giving the judge his complete attention. "You look uncomfortable," he said softly. "Is it the wine?" Judge Harlan forced a tight smile. "This is ridiculous." "Is it?" the boss asked. Under the table, the bodyguard carefully eased the panel open, just enough to confirm what he already suspected. His expression hardened almost imperceptibly. He looked up. "Sir." One word. Low. That was enough. The boss stood slowly. The movement wasn't rushed. It wasn't aggressive. It was controlled power. Chairs scraped across marble floors as guests instinctively shifted away. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said smoothly, adjusting his stained jacket as if this were part of the evening's entertainment. "A minor inconvenience." Two more of his men moved discreetly toward the exits, not blocking them, just occupying them. Marin's heart was pounding so loudly Nina thought the entire room could hear it. The boss's eyes locked onto Judge Harlan again. "You've been quiet," he said. "That's unusual for you." The judge's hand trembled slightly as he set down his glass. "I don't know what game you're playing," he said. "No," the boss replied evenly. "You do." The bodyguard reached further under the table and withdrew his hand. In it was a small metallic device no bigger than a deck of cards. Clean, professionally placed, wires tucked with precision, not amateur. Nina's stomach twisted. A few guests gasped. The boss looked at it without flinching. Then he looked at the judge. "You chose a loud place," the boss said. "That disappoints me." Judge Harlan's face went white. "This has nothing to do with me." The boss tilted his head slightly. "Doesn't it?" Silence. Then something changed. The two men along the wall, the ones Nina had noticed earlier, shifted position again. But this time, not subtly. Their eyes flicked toward the device, then toward the judge, not toward the boss. That was the detail. The boss saw it too. He smiled faintly. "You were never protecting me," he said to the judge. "You were protecting yourself." The judge stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. "You think I would—" "I think," the boss interrupted calmly, "you panicked." The room felt smaller. Nina's phone buzzed again against her hip. Another security alert. Another word flashed briefly when she dared to glance. Remote active. Her breath caught. Someone wasn't waiting for proximity. Someone was watching. The boss saw her reaction. "What now?" he asked quietly. She met his eyes. "It's not pressure-triggered," she whispered. "It's remote." For the first time, the boss's expression changed fully. Not fear, focus. "How long?" he asked. Nina's fingers flew across her phone beneath her apron, pulling up the internal staff app Marin had once shown her as a joke. Nina had memorized more than she should have. A live systems panel blinked red. Signal detected. External. She swallowed. "Active signal," she said. "Already connected." The judge's composure shattered. "This is insane," he snapped. "You can't seriously believe I would—" The boss stepped closer to him. The movement was so smooth it felt like gravity shifted. "You arranged this dinner," the boss said. "You insisted on this table." Judge Harlan's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The two men along the wall moved again, this time subtly toward the service corridor. Nina saw it. Marin saw it. The boss saw it. "They're not mine," Nina whispered. The boss didn't look at her. "I know," he said. He turned slightly and spoke without raising his voice. "Lock the kitchen." Marin hesitated only a half a second before nodding and moving quickly. The guests were no longer pretending to relax. Panic flickered openly now. Phones were out, eyes were wide, but no one moved. Because when the boss was still, the room stayed still. Judge Harlan's breathing had become uneven. "You don't understand," he said. "They said—" "Who?" the boss asked. The judge froze. Too late. The two men near the wall exchanged a look, and then one of them reached slowly inside his jacket. Not fast, not dramatic, calculated. Nina's heart slammed. The boss didn't even glance at him. Instead, he looked directly at Nina. "You're very observant," he said calmly. "Stay that way." Then everything moved at once. Chairs toppled. One of the boss's men lunged. The metallic device on the table blinked once, red. The judge screamed. And Nina realized the wine had never been about humiliation. It had been about seconds. Seconds that were now running out. The man reaching into his jacket never finished the motion. One of the boss's security men crashed into him from the side, slamming him against the wall hard enough to rattle the framed artwork. The second suspicious man bolted toward the service corridor. Guests screamed, glasses shattered, but the boss didn't duck. He stepped back once, just once, placing solid wood between himself and the device now blinking red on the table. Judge Harlan stumbled backward, knocking over his chair completely. "I didn't authorize this," he shouted. "This wasn't the plan." The boss turned his head slowly toward him. "The plan," he repeated quietly. Under the table, the metallic device pulsed again. Red, red, red. Nina's mind raced through everything she'd seen on the staff dashboard. Signal strength, remote ping, the fact that it had connected from inside the building, not outside. "It's not outside," she said quickly. The boss glanced at her. "What?" "The signal," Nina said, pulling the phone out fully now. "It's internal. It's inside the club." That changed the math. The boss's gaze sharpened. The second man who had bolted was halfway to the kitchen doors when Marin slammed the security override on the wall. The steel partition dropped halfway, catching the man at the shoulders. He cursed, struggling. The room was chaos now, but controlled chaos. The boss's men moved like they had rehearsed panic. The device blinked faster. Judge Harlan was sweating openly now. "You don't understand," he said hoarsely. "They said it was leverage. Just leverage." "Leverage?" the boss asked. The judge's composure snapped. "They said if I cooperated, they'd leave my family alone." The words landed heavy. For a split second, the boss didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. "You chose to play both sides," he said quietly. Nina's phone vibrated again. A map overlay flickered on screen. Signal triangulation. She didn't know she had access to that function, but she did. A blinking dot appeared. Not near the door, not near the device. Near the bar. Nina's eyes snapped up. At the bar, the young man in the blue suit, who had been recording earlier, wasn't panicking. He was calm. Too calm. And his phone was angled low, pointed not at the chaos, but at the boss. "It's him," Nina said. The boss followed her line of sight. The young man in blue realized he'd been noticed. His jaw tightened. Then he dropped the phone and ran. The boss moved, not wildly, not shouting. He moved with lethal clarity. Two of his men intercepted the runner before he made it 3 steps. The phone skidded across the marble floor, spinning to a stop near Nina's shoe. She bent instinctively and grabbed it. The screen was still active. A control interface. A timer. 7 seconds. Her heart stopped. "It's on a delay," she said. The boss was already beside her. "How do you stop it?" Nina's mind fired through logic. If it was remote, the trigger had to stay connected. She looked at the signal strength bar. Full. The blue-suited man was pinned against the wall, shouting something about federal protection. The boss ignored him. "Kill the signal," Nina said. "Now!" The boss snapped his fingers. One of his men yanked the phone from the captive's hand and crushed it against the marble. The blinking on Nina's screen flickered. Signal strength dropped. The device under the table blinked erratically. 3 seconds. 2. Then, dark. The red light vanished. Silence hit the room like a physical force. No explosion, no blast, just the echo of breath. Nina realized she had been holding hers. The boss looked at her, long, evaluating. Around them, the guests were in various stages of shock, some crouched under tables, some filming, some praying. Judge Harlan had collapsed into his chair, face buried in his hands. The blue-suited man was restrained, struggling uselessly. The boss crouched slowly beside the metallic device on the table. He picked it up carefully. "Not amateur," he murmured. Then he stood and faced Judge Harlan. "You didn't intend to kill me," he said calmly. "You intended to prove you could." The judge shook his head violently. "They promised protection," he said. "They said if I delivered you, they'd clear everything." "Clear what?" the boss asked. The judge's silence was answer enough. The boss's gaze hardened. "You're compromised," he said. Judge Harlan laughed weakly. "I've been compromised for years." The room was no longer pretending this was dinner. This was exposure. The boss looked back at Nina. "You saved my life," he said plainly. She didn't feel like she had. She felt like she had stepped into something much larger than wine and table settings. "I spilled wine," she said. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "No," he replied. "You bought time." He stepped closer to her, lowering his voice. "Why?" Nina hesitated. Because the answer wasn't simple. Because she hadn't acted out of loyalty. She had acted because something was wrong. And because she was tired of pretending she didn't see wrong things. "You didn't look surprised when he panicked," she said quietly. The boss studied her face. "And what does that mean?" he asked. "It means," Nina said carefully, "you already knew someone here was planning something." The boss didn't deny it. Around them, sirens began to echo faintly in the distance. Police, or something like it. The boss's men exchanged looks. The blue-suited man started smiling through split lips. "Too late," he muttered. "You're all finished." The boss didn't look at him. He looked at Nina. "You have good instincts," he said. Then he glanced toward the windows as flashing lights painted the walls in red and blue. "And now," he added softly, "you're in this." The first police officers entered with hands near their weapons, but not drawing them. They had that look, the look of men who had been told to expect something complicated. The flashing lights outside painted the private club in alternating red and blue, turning crystal chandeliers into interrogation lamps. Guests began talking all at once. "I want my lawyer." "I was just having dinner." "I didn't see anything." The boss didn't raise his voice. "Everyone stays seated," he said calmly. And they did. The lead officer stepped forward, scanning the room, then freezing when he recognized who was standing near the center of it. "Well," the officer said carefully, "this is unexpected." The boss offered a faint nod. "Maintenance issue," he replied. The officer's eyes drifted to the metallic device on the table. "Looks like more than maintenance." Nina stood slightly behind the boss now, not hiding but not exposed either. Her phone was still in her hand. The blue-suited man, restrained near the wall, started shouting. "They planted it. He runs everything. You don't know who you're protecting." The officer glanced toward him. "Who are you?" The man laughed. "Someone who thought your department still believed in evidence." That word, evidence, hung in the air. Nina felt something click. The phone. The recording. She had started it before the wine hit the table. She had audio of everything. The judge's panic. The bodyguard finding the device. The blue-suited man running. The remote trigger. The confession. Proof. The boss sensed the shift in her posture. "What?" he asked quietly. She swallowed. "I recorded it," she said. He held her gaze. "All of it." For the first time since the wine spilled, the boss looked genuinely surprised. Judge Harlan looked up sharply. "You can't—" the judge started. Nina stepped slightly forward. I can. The officer's attention snapped to her. You recorded this? He asked. Nina nodded. The room shifted again. Power doesn't disappear. It relocates. The boss studied her, weighing options in real time. You understand what that means, he said softly. She did. It meant she now held leverage over everyone in the room. The judge, the planted attackers, the boss, everyone. The blue-suited man barked a laugh. See, he said, you can't silence all of us. The officer extended a hand. I need that phone. Nina hesitated. The boss didn't move to stop her. That was the test. If he had reached for it, the room would have seen it as control. Instead, he waited. The officer's hand remained steady. Miss, he said gently, if there was an attempted attack here, that recording is evidence. Nina looked at the judge. He wouldn't meet her eyes. She looked at the blue-suited man. He looked almost relieved. Then she looked at the boss. His face was unreadable, not pleading, not threatening, just watching. You said I'm in this, she told him quietly. Yes. Then I decide how. A flicker of something crossed his face. Respect. She turned to the officer. I'll share it, she said, but not just with you. The officer frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means, Nina said calmly, this doesn't disappear into a report. The room went very still. The boss's gaze sharpened. You're negotiating, he observed. Yes, she replied. Judge Harlan suddenly stood, desperate. You don't understand how this works, he said to her. You don't understand who gets hurt if this goes public. Nina met his eyes. Someone almost died tonight. The judge faltered. The boss spoke quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. You're young. That doesn't make me wrong. He studied her for a long moment. Outside, more sirens approached. The officer lowered his hand slightly. What are you asking for? He asked. Nina's pulse hammered, but her voice didn't shake. Immunity, she said. For me and for the club staff. Marin's breath caught softly behind her. The officer blinked. That's not something I can promise on the spot. Then call someone who can, Nina replied. The blue-suited man started laughing again. You think they'll protect you? He said. They'll bury this. The boss finally turned toward him. No, he said evenly. They won't. The blue-suited man's smile faltered, because the boss wasn't angry. He was calculating. If this becomes public, the boss continued calmly, it implicates people far above you. The officer stiffened slightly. The judge went pale again. You were the shield, the boss told the judge quietly. And now you've cracked. The truth settled into the room like smoke. The judge hadn't been the mastermind. He had been leverage, a legal wall. And someone had decided to remove the wall. The boss looked back at Nina. You have something very valuable, he said. She nodded. And you don't scare me, she replied. A faint, almost invisible smile touched his face. That's new, he said. The officer's radio crackled. Instructions. Names. Nina felt the weight of her decision pressing against her ribs. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She wasn't just a foster kid. She was the one holding the match. The officer straightened. We're taking statements, he said. Nina looked at the boss one last time before stepping toward the police. He didn't stop her. He didn't threaten her. He simply said one quiet sentence. Be careful who you trust next. And for the first time that night, Nina wondered whether saving him had been the beginning or the mistake. The statements took hours. By the time the last flashing lights dimmed outside the club, the guests were gone. The broken glass had been swept and the metallic device was sealed inside an evidence bag. But the real damage wasn't on the table. It was in the silence. Nina sat in a private office upstairs with a detective and an assistant district attorney who had arrived halfway through the chaos. They spoke carefully. Too carefully. They weren't shocked by what happened. They were shocked that it failed. "You're certain the judge said they promised protection?" the ADA asked. "Yes," Nina replied. "He said they told him if he cooperated, they'd clear everything." "Everything meaning what?" He didn't say, but she could guess. The detective leaned back. "And you're certain the signal came from inside the building?" "Yes." He exchanged a look with the ADA. That look said more than any answer. This wasn't a simple assassination attempt. It was a message. And someone had expected it to work. Downstairs, in what had once been a private dining room, the boss remained seated at the same table, the wine stain still dark on his vest. Most of his men were gone. He had dismissed them. Only Marin stood near the door. "You should leave," she told him quietly. He didn't move. Not yet. He replayed the evening in his mind like a ledger. The judge panicking. The device placed professionally. The blue-suited man running. The signal internal. The police arriving almost too quickly. Someone had wanted him exposed. Not dead. Exposed. And the only reason it failed was because a waitress had noticed a crooked panel. He exhaled slowly. "Nina," he said. Marin nodded once and went upstairs. When Nina returned, she looked different. Not scared, not shaken. Focused. The boss studied her. "You gave them the recording?" he asked. "Yes." "Copies?" "Yes." He nodded. "Smart." She didn't respond. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. She didn't sit. "That was not random," he said calmly. "That was coordinated." "I know." "You think the judge was the mastermind?" "No." He tilted his head slightly. "Good." She met his eyes. "They were testing you," she said. "Testing whether the legal shield would hold." "And?" "It didn't." The boss's jaw tightened subtly. "No," he agreed. "It didn't." There it was, the truth. The judge had been their protection, their legal firewall, the reason investigations stalled, the reason raids never fully materialized. And someone had just tried to remove him from the equation. Not to kill the boss, to weaken him. The boss leaned back. "Do you know what happens when protection cracks?" he asked. Nina didn't blink. "Everyone starts hunting." A faint smile appeared. "You're learning fast." She crossed her arms slightly. "I didn't do this for you." "I know." He stood slowly. The movement was deliberate, controlled. "You acted because something felt wrong," he said. "And because you're tired of watching powerful people assume no one sees them." She didn't deny it. He walked past her toward the door, then paused. "People are going to approach you," he said. "Law enforcement, reporters, others." "Others?" she asked. He glanced back at her. "The ones who failed tonight." A chill ran down her spine. "You think they'll come after me?" He considered that. "I think they'll try to understand you." She didn't like the sound of that. "And you?" she asked. "Me?" "Yes. What happens now?" He adjusted his jacket slightly, ignoring the dried wine. "Now," he said calmly, "I remove the weakness." Her stomach tightened. "You mean the judge?" "I mean," he corrected smoothly, "the system that made him useful." The weight of that sentence settled heavily. The boss wasn't panicking. He wasn't retreating. He was recalculating. "And where does that leave me?" Nina asked. He studied her one last time. "You had nothing tonight," he said, "and you walked away with leverage over everyone in that room." He stepped closer, not threatening, just close enough to make the point clear. "That makes you valuable." "I don't want to be valuable to you," she replied. A quiet pause. "That," he said, "is why you are." Marin cleared her throat softly near the door. The police were ready to escort remaining witnesses. Nina felt the night pressing down on her. She had spilled wine to buy seconds. Those seconds had exposed a crack in something much larger than one dinner. The judge would fall. But not because of the device, because his usefulness had expired, and someone else would try to take his place. The boss moved toward the exit. As he passed Nina, he spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "You were right about one thing." She looked at him. "I was the target," he said. Then he walked out into the fading blue lights without looking back. Nina stood alone in the now quiet room. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She wasn't just a foster kid who noticed details. She was someone who had interrupted a plan powerful men thought was inevitable. And in doing so, she had stepped into a game where protection wasn't given. It was traded. The doors of the club reopened one by one as the lockdown lifted. Outside, the city continued as if nothing had shifted. But Nina knew it had, because the Mafia had just realized something terrifying. Their shield wasn't unbreakable. And the person who exposed the crack was a girl they had never thought to notice.